2, and 1.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Whittle. I am a member of the programming team at Film at Lincoln Center in New York, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual space to bring you the summer edition of our ongoing free summer program, Film at Lincoln Center Talks, which is generously presented by our partners, HBO. This talk was occasioned by a limited time run that Film at Lincoln Center has been hosting of the film Hale County This Morning, This Evening, directed by RaMell Ross, which we've been really proud to offer for rental in our virtual cinema free of charge. The engagement started on Friday, June 19th, just last week, and it's running through tomorrow, Thursday. So if you haven't seen the film yet, or you want to revisit the film, you can check it out on our website. It's this free rental offer will last through the day tomorrow. For those of you who are new to Film at Lincoln Center, we're a nonprofit organization that has proudly been home to the New York film community for more than 50 years. Every fall we present the New York Film Festival, and throughout the year we screen films in our theaters. And most recently, in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, online in our virtual cinema. None of what we do would be possible without the support of our members, patrons, dedicated audiences, and people tuning in like you. We hope that you'll consider joining our membership community, which supports free programs like this, and it also allows you to enjoy ticket discounts, members-only events, and exclusive content. So you can check that out on our website as well. Before we get this conversation going, I just want to take a minute to highlight a few upcoming films and offerings that we think you might be interested in. First of all, I will invite you to join us for an upcoming free talk, an installment in the same series of talks, which will take place on July 6th at 5 p.m. to discuss the essential new documentary, John Lewis, Good Trouble, a documentary about Representative John Lewis, which is opening on July 3rd in the FLC Virtual Cinema. For the talk on July 6th, we're going to be joined by the director, Dawn Porter, producer, Erica Alexander, and the composer for the film, Tamar Kali. You can, if you're on YouTube now, if you're watching this live, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel for playlists, which include filmmaker conversations on race and the Black experience, LGBTQ storytelling, and of course, everything else. It's all exclusive to our YouTube channel, so it's worth a deep dive. And last but not least, don't forget to check out our virtual cinema on our website, which is full of a curated selection of this year's most exciting and noteworthy new and restored films from a number of our distributor partners. This includes a really exciting mini retrospective of the South Korean filmmaker Hong Sang-soo, as well as prize-winning films from the Berlinale, Cannes Film Festival, and lots more. You can find all of this information about FLC and our lineup at filmlink.org. So I don't want to take up too much more time from this event, but I do want to say a few words about the participants in this talk who we're really, really, really thrilled to have with us today, and grateful to them for that. First of all, leading the discussion will be Garrett Bradley, filmmaker, who works across narrative, documentary, and experimental modes of filmmaking to address themes including race, class, familiar relationships, social justice, Southern culture, and the history of film in the United States. Garrett was awarded the 2017 Sundance Jury Prize for her short film Alone. And in January of this year, 2020, she became the first Black American woman to receive Best Director at the Sundance Film Festival for her feature-length documentary, Time. And I'm excited to hear her say more about that. And then the central, the filmmaker who inspired this talk was RaMell Ross, the director of Hale County This Morning, This Evening. He is a visual artist, a filmmaker, and a writer based in Rhode Island and Alabama. He's been the recipient of numerous artist fellowships over the years and currently teaches in Brown University's visual art department. His feature documentary, Hale County This Morning, This Evening, won a special jury award for creative vision at the 2018 Sundance Film Festival and was nominated for an Oscar at the 91st Academy Awards, and has screened in cinematheques around the world, including in the 2018 edition of our New Directors New Films Festival, which is co-presented annually by Film at Lincoln Center and the Museum of Modern Art. So that's my whole spiel. I wanna let you guys get to it, but just to say that I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. So to our audience, please enjoy this talk with RaMell Ross and Garrett Bradley.
Thank you, Maddie.
Thanks, Maddie. Garrett, you're the best.
Man, I hope, I feel like we could just tell jokes.
Yeah.
We're not gonna do that though.
Oh man, so many jokes.
So there's a couple things. One, the Zoom thing, I've watched a lot of Zooms and I've been trying to like think about how I can personally contribute to the improvement of how those conversations go. Because I find that it's like, I was talking to my mom about this, I find that it's like, it just turns into like monologue, like one monologue, monologue, and it's like not really a conversation. So I think that there's like, I've got some ideas and some things I want to talk about, but we can go wherever we want. And there's also people who are watching this apparently who are also going to ask questions. So they'll pop up and we can see how we feel and all of that.
Okay. Yeah, I really don't mind being interrupted, and I'm with you. Like I had to teach half of one of my classes on Zoom, and it just turns into a person like jump roping with a person's conversation and being like, "Can I say now what?" And then you end up, it's hard to listen because you're like you're ready to talk, but then it's just like all a mess.
Yeah.
And so
yeah,
do all the tricks. You know, like
okay,
this is
we're
the
gonna
time.
try
Experimentation.
So, yeah, well, I rewatched the film a few times actually, and I have to say that part of the reason why I'm so excited to talk to you is because it really, and this is going to sound crazy, but it really feels like a religious text on some level, because it's like you can enter it at like any point, you know, and really get something from it. And I want to know what you think about that, but really quickly, I think for context for folks who are watching, Hale County is in Alabama, which is in America. It's a town of about 16,000 people, I think, is what I read on Wikipedia. And Walker Evans in the 1930s went there and did a whole photographic series on white sharecroppers in the 1930s. So maybe a good place to start is RaMell Ross coming to Hale County 82 years after Walker Evans as an instructor and a basketball coach. What was for you, you know, I feel like the question for filmmakers is always like, how did you come to this story? But as a photographer, I'm actually really curious, like, what was the emotional journey for you with this in terms of not only the story, but like the transition points of still images to moving images? Did you know what you were doing? How did you keep a sense of confidence while you were doing it if you didn't know what you were doing?
Whew, this is going to be a tough conversation, Garrett, because the depth of the questions are so deep, and I do prefer to completely exhaust the question, which means that this live thing could go on for eternity. But
yeah.
I love the religious text thing like that. That's I would argue for myself maybe the greatest compliment of the film. Then, you know, because regardless of the problems of religion, and regardless of the glory and grace and necessary saviorness of religion, quite often like it's just like connection to something bigger than yourself is what religion tends to be, whether or not it's, you know, Eastern or whether or not it's overtly Western. And so yeah, the film is meant to be an experience. And so to tie religion to the film means that it's giving you something that's physiological, you know, something that is like in your cells, in your bones, in the idea of faith, something bigger than the narratives that we put on ourselves. So thanks, Garrett. But I think actually, you know, Hale County, I think the county has 16,000 total. You know, I think there's a weird stat where there's like 4 times more stray dogs in Hale County than people or something.
Whoa.
Right? Nothing to do with film, but like
Yeah, I
Maybe-
wonder like if it's like pit bull, like what kind of vibe, dog vibe it is.
I'll tell you one thing, if that status true, there's no such thing as a purebred, you know? All
Yeah.
those dogs, they're just making dogs. That's what they're doing all the time.
Like heaven, man.
Right? But the emotional experience of the film was I think kind of like the question of all the questions you asked that like really kind of anchored me in like abstraction, which is what I really like, because the process was so profound to be so deeply involved in another person's life, and to see with them in moments of their life that typically people don't have access to unless you're in their quote unquote nuclear family. And so I constantly be leaving the Daniel and Quincy spaces just thankful for the learning of what it's like to be part of other people's meaning making space, you know? Like everything that we learn is essentially made through our family, like the way we learn to love, the way we learn humor, the way we learn, and of course many other factors, environment and culture and media, but like our parents teach us, or our brothers and sisters teach us. And so the emotional experience was one of just like just expansive, just like becoming more aware of the narrowness through which my life has produced my life and produced my understanding of the world, my ideas of virtue, my ideas of justice, my ideas of wrong or anger or whatever. And so, yeah, and I wonder, because that's something that's quite, I mean, I watched your film Time most recently, and me just saying what I said makes me think deeply about that in relationship to that film. And I don't know if you want to go too deeply into your film that hasn't been released, that is absolutely mind-blowingly intimate and like it's all the stuff that is missing from Black film, quote unquote. And so I wonder what your relationship then of being so close to your protagonist and that family was.
Wasn't ready for that one.
Just the ode, zooming it back.
I mean, I think that it's funny because my question to you was, and it's going to be a follow-up after I answer this, was also really about like the kind of practical transition of being a photographer. And when you start to embrace, because I find a lot of like young photographers, for instance, like students, they get so intimidated by the camera, by the motion picture camera, or like by video. And it always astounds me because it's like, you have the eye, like it's there in the still photography. So what is it? Where does that insecurity start to come in? And like, what's that journey when you start to incorporate movement? But to answer your question, I think that for me, I mostly am working in film. I do photography, but my language has been so much about motion that I think it was about being with Fox and her family in the present moment. But it was actually, I think, also about me trying to understand the family to the extent where the camera could almost anticipate a day, And so the connection, I was really kind of curating the shots and curating our experience to a certain extent based on what I knew outside of the camera, which I think is sort of maybe, I don't know if it's the same or completely different than the process you're speaking of. And then all of that was completely thwarted, by the fact that there was all this incredible archive that she'd been shooting of herself for the past 21 years that I was not aware of while we were shooting. And that then created a completely different relationship between my own comfort zone and the story that I thought I was telling, and my relationship also to her and her vulnerability and who she was, who I thought she was, in terms of the person, you and I, if we were to meet today, I wouldn't really necessarily have a full holistic sense of who you were 10 years ago, right? Because we're constantly evolving. And so to have the benefit of having that juxtaposition created a new relationship of intimacy with the project. But I think actually, and I have another question about that in regards to time, because I think not the film time, but time in general, which is
But Garrett, I would like to take you up quickly on the question about photography and
Yeah,
the one difference. And it's, to me, it's really interesting to see photographers go to film, because I'm not quite sure like the languages are the same, you know, like they're actually quite different. And I would argue myself that like film and film language skipped photography. It got so obsessed with motion that it forgot all about the nuances of semiotics and the nuances of perception and all of the things that can be, like the image being the most complex space that you can create in a single instant. And kind of foregone that instant for the multiplicity of instances for the greater thesis. And so in me going to film from photography, I thought, okay, we need to address notions of Blackness here. And if the problem of representation exists in the image, I can't not start with the image logic first. Like everything has to kind of question the fundamental act of perceiving the idea of Blackness. And maybe that sounds like a little bit twisty and probably incomplete in some way, but I think when you take very seriously every instance, you realize that while you're making something, you have the potential to like prove one thing while disproving another. Like to me, like to some degree, it's not about, you know, proving the humanity of people in images. It's about dispelling inferiority. But you can make a portrait of someone that like shows that they're so human and all these beautiful details, but like it doesn't affect the mind of someone who's already believing that the person is something else. Like the sensitivity of the image isn't going to change someone's mind. And so to me, necessarily, of course. And so to me, I wanted to like make images that could function outside of the utility of film, which is tethering it constantly and neutering it and spading it for a thesis. So I wanted all the images to be like ambiguous so that they could serve multiple functions, serve multiple imaginaries. And the photographic approach is perfect for that because it is about singular complexity to some degree, you know?
Wow. So, okay. So I wanted, coming off of that, there's this incredible, I mean, there's so many fucking incredible moments, but one that I want to narrow in on is, and it's a repeated image of the main road. It seems like it's like Main Street maybe of the town.
Yeah.
And we see it once in the beginning of the film, and then it's somewhere like midway and at another point. And the second time we see it, it goes from the main road then to someone's personal road, like a private road. And then we cut to Burt Williams, who, for those who don't know, you know, it's actually an excerpt from the 1913 film Limekiln Club Field Day, which the Museum of Modern Art discovered 100 years after it had been shot and reassembled it. And Burt Williams was, I think, making more money than the president during the time at his heyday. And
go Burt.
Yeah, go Burt,
Good
man.
for you, Burt.
And I feel like and so it brings me to this question about time, where we're in the meaning of images, because on one hand, the thing I love about the road and the persistence of the road is that it sort of proposes and creates a level of linearity throughout the film that I think a lot of viewers actually felt maybe wasn't there. But when I was watching it, I felt like it's so linear, actually. It's like really, it has a really solid backbone. It's not it's not actually as elliptical maybe as it seems. And so you open the film up, and I'm paraphrasing here, with some text that says, using time to figure out how we have come to be seen. And so when I saw that Burt Williams moment, a part of me, and right after we go from Burt Williams, we see a guy burning rubber, then we go back to Burt, then we come back to present moment of a guy talking about the future and the possibilities of what it would be like to not have guns in the world. So I guess my question is, in your mind, who are we being seen by in this film? You know, is it our ancestors? Is it something external? Is it a thwarting of the imagery in the same way that you're talking about?
Who are we being seen by? I would ask you then, who are we claiming is being seen?
Well, see, like I feel like there are these moments where you're taking images like this one, for instance, where like this one, or even the cotton fields, where there's that long tracking shot of the cotton fields and we hear the auditorium underneath. And it actually reminds me a lot of that Steve McQueen, The Widows, that scene where Colin Farrell gets in the car and he's like the politician, he drives through Chicago and we see just that, right? That one track.
I love that shot. And like ends up at the house, his house. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was so understated.
And you see like a whole neighborhood change, you understand the history. So history, I guess what I'm saying, is implicit in the images, but you're flipping them in a certain kind of way. You're like kind of creating new understandings around them. And so I personally felt, if you're asking me, like I personally felt like it was this incredible, the whole film feels like we are seeing each other, you know, and it is our ancestors also reflecting back on us.
Yeah, geez, I'm like trying to get comfortable to answer the question or to talk about it. I'm like,
it really did there, man.
I'm like, I don't want to look like I'm looking down at anyone that's watching, but like, how do I? Damn, Garrett, it's like when I say we've come to be seen, I'm thinking about the way, like, I love this line by Henry Bergson, I think it is, who says that perception is coterminous with memory, right? So the act of looking at something is simultaneously a withdrawal from your memory bank. And so if we think about the amount of images that have been created with Black folks being represented in them and who have made them and the purpose of those images, we realize, and this is excluding the Black Family Archive, which is existing in many homes, but isn't popularly, disseminated in the same ways and in the same, with the same sort of power or support. We realize that the way in which we've come to be seen, as in humans, as in Black folks, but also white folks as well, is not the way that reality is in the places in which those people exist. And so for me, the only way to really get to the root of that is to offer an image, one that is either an image you've never seen before, because if you offer someone an image they've never seen before, then they're forced into the acknowledgement that they've never seen it. And then they can ask themselves perhaps why. And then they could also look at that image and see the way in which it's sort of just configuring a reality that is outside of what they would expect. Like, that's a really strange thing. Like, oh, I didn't quite realize that this thing existed. And so, I don't know. I also think that when you make an image that's like extremely ambiguous, what do you like? You like point to the purpose of, this is also an interesting thing. I'm like I have a very difficult time following long threads of thought because there's so many associations, right? If you like, I think that images are, I hate dropping names and quoting people, but like this guy, William James, said that like truth is an adjective, right? It's like used to accent something for a purpose. Like, it's not like that's true, but I feel like images are too. Like, images are their use. Like, an image of a person of color means in whatever way it's being used or employed. So to make images that are open allows the use to not be extremely clear, which then like clarifies exactly what it is, which is whatever you want it to be, not whatever the person who made it intended it to be. There's like a little space that happens. And so, how we've come to be seen.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I think there's something interesting about, so the images in and of themselves and thinking about abstraction and their openness. I totally get. There's something else happening for me though that I want to know how you feel about it, which is that then, and which is again, what's different in photography, which is in film, you have the benefit then of juxtaposing these images next to each other.
Mhm.
And so like, when there's this moment, for instance, of the woman, I can't remember her name, but we see her a few times with the little girl, and she kind of like is very playful with her, and she's teasing her about not knowing her name. She's like 3 years old. She's like asking her phone number and her address, very adult shit.
Yeah.
And the little girl's just looking at her. And then we cut then to being in a classroom where we see an adult, you know, talking about having sort of a sense of nostalgia for, as someone who grew up in a city, for tradition and for the South. And so there was, for me, like a very clear connection that was made about education or about what we're supposed to know or not know. And so I guess maybe in the process of shooting, there's one thing, but how were you thinking about these same ideas of isolated abstract images, and how did that change when you started putting them up against each other, when you started cutting?
Yeah. Well, new meaning, you know, is created when you put images beside each other. Like you're forced to reckon with, you know, the past and the present, which is like creates a narrative fundamentally, a time-based thing. But I, you know, in terms of like form and ambiguity, it's more about like the narrative and the images not being overdetermined. They each have extreme intent and purpose, like from my perspective, and you know, from Jocelyn Barnes, Maya Krinsky, and Rob Moss, who were on the edit team with me. Like we spent a hell of a lot of time micro creating meaning from my perspective in order to offer an ambiguity to someone else. Because if you make something that's super personal and super idiosyncratic, no one else has access to that information. So they're forced to deal with whatever sort of, whatever they're thinking. And so with like the meaning that happens between the images, that's like my logic. And that's like what you're saying is not necessarily what I wanted to, you know, create from that, but your interpretation obviously is the truth of your moment and the truth of the film, because it's open to everyone's truth simultaneously. And that's what I believe has been a big problem with images, is that, and with images of people of color, is that they haven't been open enough for people to come to their own conclusions. They've been forced into narrow, you know, pathways, which is a shitty form of over-determination, you know?
Yeah.
But it is like, I think, you know, Garrett, like one thing, like I don't know, like the framing of the images, what was most important is like the framing, so that it has like a sort of aesthetic taste. But like a lot of the images in the film, the sort of aim was this thing that I like to call the epic banal, you know, which is like an epic moment in something that's incredibly simple. And I like to explain it that like, I wanted a lot of the images for there to be like a moment, like for the sun to rise in moments of blackness, you know, really fast, where like the fireworks happen, where the young girls are gasping, and you're also kind of gasping because there is some sort of transition in the space of ambiguity that is so human and so universal, but simultaneously kind of ambiguous. Like it doesn't have a purpose outside of itself existing, you know, but it's in a film, so that's not necessarily true.
That, you know, it reminds me, so there's also a quote, I think from an earlier interview that I was reading you did with Film Comment, and you were quoting Darby English, who's an art historian and curator and professor at the University of Chicago. And you said, or this is a quote, I believe, from him, from Darby, that says, in order for Black work to escape the label of Blackness, it needs strategic formalism. It needs something that's beautiful enough for it not to be reduced. Can you talk to me about that a little bit? What does that mean? Because I feel like I get it. But there's
you get it. You do the same thing. I mean, yeah, strategic formalism was like a mind-blowing combination of words, first of all, but like in the context in which Darby English talks about it, is basically the idea that, and like one of his examples is a David Hammons piece, which is, you know, was really brilliant and like this masterful experiential performance, not performance, but what would it be? It'd be situational art, or I don't know. And David Hammons did this piece, and the way in which it was written about it was just all about the Blackness and the equality and representation and all of these elements that were confining it to this thing that he calls Black representational space. And Black representational space is a space in which Blackness is othered. It's not part of the human condition. It's not part of the vast human social network of meaning and feeling. It's something that exists only in the context of oppression and American oppression, Black oppression and slavery and all of this. And he's saying, and then he writes about the piece and he's like, this piece is doing X, Y, and Z. And they failed to notice that. And a way to get outside of this Black representational space is to make something that is just so grand, like so beautiful, so magnificent, so just like experientially devastating in every good and tragic way simultaneously, that you don't even care what the identity of the person is. And that's a way to sort of like expand notions of Blackness, to have it have an aesthetic value. Not necessarily, but there's so many different types of ways to accomplish it. It's just like a thought experiment of form. And form can be a conceptual thing too, but
Yeah. And I feel like you achieved that like so perfectly.
Stop it, Garrett.
No, really. And yeah, because the thing where it gets really interesting for me is that while that's true, it also doesn't escape its Blackness,
Yeah.
and the Blackness and our history is also entwined in all of that. And I think as filmmakers, it's like you make a film and then you kind of have to, I think, figure out how you want to talk about it, because you're anticipating a lot of different questions, and those questions end up in a lot of ways reframing. I think, as you're saying, Darby English was talking about in regard to Hammons, it starts to reframe the way in which we see the work just by the very question, that's presented.
Yeah.
What do you think about, so you were saying, like, I think abstraction, we were talking about ventriloquism actually briefly. Do you want to talk about that? Because I feel like it's kind of a nice transition point, but maybe that's too much. We can also go, we did get a question. Do you want to?
Got a question?
Yeah, we did. From
Veronica. Let's go. Oh, Veronica.
Yeah.
I bet it sounds, go ahead, sorry.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have technical advice for aspiring documentary directors who would like to film their subjects with the same intimacy and low impact, such as a crew size, equipment, etc., as we have seen in your films?
Yeah, I would first say that the first step to making anything that's relatively as soft and tender as Hale County or Garrett's Film Time or Garrett's Film America or Garrett's Film Alone, or if anyone's seen Easter Snap, is to not think of those who you're filming as subjects, as to think of them as protagonists or characters. Just as in a language game, to me, one of the root problems with the camera is that it has some sort of scientific connotation when you use subject. And that has always been the problem as it relates to people of color being filmed, right? Like, you could take a picture of someone's head and like all of a sudden phrenology is a thing, and you're like, yes, their frontal lobe is big, so therefore their brain is small, like all of these weird things. And I think documentary, I think photography, it needs to be divorced from notions of visual truth and need to be more associated with visual imagination and visual like framing of a certain perspective of not truth, but perspective, which is also truth. And so just a technical, a thing of diction perhaps. But I would say your question was about like how to film with intimacy, maybe?
Yeah, it sounds, I think so. Like, how would you,
I just forgot the question completely.
What's the sauce, man? What's the sauce? Well, I think you're though the what you just said though in terms of like the form and the process too, it kind of reminds me of something I wanted to bring up, which was that the film was nominated for an Academy Award, and I think that was really it felt for a lot of filmmakers and I think a lot of artists like a major turning point for just being a maker, you know, and also just like what it meant to be in an American canon in any kind of way.
Yeah.
And the thing that I find, I think the reason, what I really want to get at with that is like why it was so monumental. And I keep thinking about documentary form and everything that you're talking about and all these considerations that go into it, why it's so difficult to like, and to what, why is this work considered experimental? And the reason why I'm asking that is because if we go back all the way to the very first film that was considered, I guess, the official documentary, which I think was Robert Flaherty's 1922 film, Nanook of the North, which was done under very, I think, questionable circumstances with the Inuit community, and was essentially a series of recreations with people. That, if that is sort of the barometer or the beginning of how we're supposed to understand the truth, or what isn't the truth, or what form is, I think that to me it reveals that we have a really long way to go, that there really isn't actually a true standard.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're interested in kind of like talking about form and maybe the direction of where things might be going right now, even in this moment of revolution where everything is changing, you know, our symbols are, you know.
Yeah. I mean, once again, like really huge, really huge. And I love the early documentary harkening back, because like documentary is just a concept. Like that's literally the only thing that it is. Fiction films are documentaries. You are literally documenting people performing, and then you're piecing together something regardless of how many times they do it. And so for me, it was incredibly important for the film Hale County This Morning, This Evening to be labeled as a documentary, because of it predisposes people to a relationship to truth, what they're about to encounter in the film. But also it's like a documentary is whatever the industry calls a film, basically. Right? I mean, you have Robert Greene's films who are incredibly fictionalized and constructed, but they hearken to or they touch up an emotional truth, or they deal with a cultural thing that it's a type of truth that can rival any other doc. I mean, in most docs the documentary genre in some way has, at least popularly, has been in the US, kind of co-opted by the nonprofit world. I would argue. And so it just becomes like a tool, not a thing that has a purpose outside of like something that's slightly narrow, but also righteous and also virtuous and important. And so I don't know. I think that there's this thing that's been happening for a long time called I'll call documentary ventriloquism, which is a type of, so like documentary ventriloquism would be when someone is like employing film and a person specifically, or a culture, to say something that they want to say, but they don't have the authority to say it because it's not their identity, you know? And we can easily say, though I don't want to be controversial, that like it's a process and a product of white culture, which has always dominated almost everything in the US by default. And so, you know, you have filmmakers that are going into communities and they're like, oh, I would like to, well, the best example is like when someone's doing an interview and they're like, cry. And the person cries and they're like, yes, the emotional moment. Like, and they said the thing about their father that I was just hoping that they would say. And now I can put that in the film. Like, that's documentary ventriloquism. You know, you're searching for a type of meaning that you've created, that you believe in, and you're employing someone else's culture, someone else's personality, someone else's everything in order to prove it. And that's something that happens with visuals too, right? Where you're like shooting towards some like universal beauty because you know that this means this B-roll has this sort of meaning, just an open field, and we're just coast along. We'll turn the camera slowly and it's airy and the bees. And then it's just like, but that's sad.
Yeah. Wow. I was actually just transported for a second. Like, serious.
Well, I mean, Zoom is really, it's way more powerful than we believe. I don't know how that happened.
What about isolation?
Ooh.
Or I should say, forget isolation. I should say solitude is really what I mean.
Big difference, yeah.
Yeah, big difference. And I mean, I'm out here in the desert, and I'm Noah Purfoy's foundation is out here, and he was an artist who mostly made like really fancy modern furniture early in his career, and then during the protests that happened at Watts, he took a lot of that rubble and sort of totally revolutionized his way of thinking about object making and thinking about value and thinking of himself as a maker and an artist. And so he kind of created new symbols out of this moment, which I think we can track like several times back, even to World War II with neorealism, and World War I with thinking about Schwitters and Rauschenberg and like trash art and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm getting at is that I think about Noah, and I think about him being like probably the only Black man out here in this desert to make his work. And even though you were not the only Black man in Hale County making this film, there are these moments throughout the film where I was reminded almost of your solitude to a certain extent. And I hear your voice talking to a person that you're with, or I hear you kind of laughing. And I guess I'm just wondering, what is that journey like? And is it similar to being a photographer and going across the country and documenting things? Because you didn't have a whole crew with you; it was just yourself, right?
Yeah.
What was that like in your best and darkest moments?
Oof. So much, like Garrett, you just made me sink into myself in the most way, full of the most heat. Man, woman. Yeah, solitude. Well, I want to connect. If I lose your original question,
It's okay.
let's find it again, because I think it's worth talking about. But it reverses one thing that we skipped over, but has to do with solitude and meaning making and photography and young photographers and intimacy and all of the things, is that we don't know, people are not visually literate, like myself included, before I started being really conscious that I of what I was consuming and how I was being consumed, and how to participate, self-righteously and righteously in a meaning-making endeavor that's both personal and true to my own sensibility. Because like, if we think about how much we learn about how to write as young kids, like we learned the alphabet, we break it down, letters, sounds, we words, then we have sentences, then we have paragraphs, and we have essays, and we have like all of these emails and stuff. We just give kids cameras and we're like, here, take the picture make, good, this means this. No, it doesn't. It does not mean that. And it's actually saying so many things, which basically is reinforcing every single thing about society when you take that picture. If you're not conscious, like it's so beautiful to build your own sensibility through images and through your visual interest, what you believe means what, and then how you deal with color and shape and angle and form. And so in terms of being a solo photographer with one camera, and the question I think Veronica asked about the intimacy, and it's about like learning yourself, learning your own visual language in the same way that a novelist would head up to the woods after years of writing, after many, many failures of writing, and successes, same thing possibly, and would write their novel, or go into a community and like do their thing. It's kind of like, it's that approach where you're like employing a really narrow like sensibility, I guess. But the solitude, so much loneliness, but also so much community. Like the Quincy and Daniel's families were essentially mine, and Hale County embraced me, and Greensboro embraced me. So I don't know if I could answer that question without a therapist.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because I think about young people a lot, and I think that they, that there's, when you're in the beginning of trying to find your voice, I think that feeling of loneliness and discomfort, of not having a guarantee, I think that that's also what it is. And so how to encourage people to get past that moment and get past that, that feeling of defeat before they've even started.
I have something to say about that, Garrett, because Hale County was not made with the expectation to be anything as big as it became. I started the project, was working super solo. I'm in conversation with the co-writer Maya Krinsky the entire time. I meet Jocelyn Barnes. She joins in the creative conceptual process, and we're working things out. And it's like the smallest film in which the only expectation is to finish the film with the integrity with which it was started, and the expectation of failure was possible the entire time, and no one pitted their food, their rent, their personal worth on the project. Like, the project was a thing that we decided to make with as much of our resources, as much of our time, but we didn't want one to have to shape it through the expectations of what other people believed films about people of color would be, about what documentaries should be, about how narratives should look, about what an experiential film should be. We just brought our own logic and our own stuff to it, with the legitimate expectation that the film would be buried, because there's some comments on, I love reading comments of people who watch the film. One comment I think online somewhere is like, who the hell wants to watch Black people do nothing? They do that anyway, or something like that.
God,
Wow. Okay, I maybe made that up. Maybe I made that up. I don't think I did. But it's probably true. I don't know. Anyway. So I think the rejection that I think I dealt with for 10 years, applying to photo competitions and winning nothing, and all of the, me attempting to be a photojournalist and this type of artist, and none of those kind of working out, and me getting really feedback that wasn't very nice about my other projects or other things, created sort of a callousness that was just I don't care. I'm just going to do this, and because I want to do this, and I'm going to spend the time to do this. And it literally is a process film. It's about the process of being in the community and shooting, with, not at, and that's good enough,
Yeah. I want to I know we're running out of time here, so we've got 2 more questions. Okay, one of the key sources of beauty in the film to me is the space, in the film length, in the positioning of the camera, in a setting, in the metaphysical. How important, intrinsic, is space to you in your work as a whole, or was it just important here specifically for the stories told in Hale County?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I love the question. And good questions like that are really difficult to answer because they're being approached from someone else's use of words, obviously. Like space. I would never talk about the film in terms of space, or what feels like a conceptual physical space that they're talking about. But my version of that, I believe, is the idea of time itself. And I like to think about the relationship between the length of time that someone's looking at something and the meaning that comes from that. One of my favorite things to say about the film, which I say almost every time I talk about it, is people, when you look at a whole bunch of words and the words dissolve, and you're just one word, the word cannonball, and you're like, oh my God, cannonball, C-A-N-O, what is language? What are letters? It just dissolves, and then all of a sudden it snaps back into place. And then you're like, oh, it's just part of this system of whatever. people generally don't look at people long enough for the social constructs to dissolve into just being like, oh, that's a human, and then like it kind of being built back up into some sort of new meaning. And if we take that as true, no one definitely looks long enough at communities, minority communities, communities of color, for them to exist outside of their construction as other, or the construction as marginalized, or the construction as Black. And so in terms of space, to me, it's just about time. It's about time spending with, it's about time looking at, it's about time looking from, and all meaning changes over time. And I would recommend for all of the artists who are interested in making, I think, work that has the capacity to be valuable outside of an instant, which is not necessarily a worthy pursuit. I'm saying like instances are great, but is to like spend a long time doing it so that you grow as a person and the meaning of your intent changes over time and everything changes over time. So you can see the way that what you thought then is not what it is now, because what you were then is different from what you are now. And like, there's nothing worse, as you know, from being a photographer and filmmaker, from making something and then all of a sudden 2 weeks later being like, damn, like what I know now, what I just read changes that. Like, give that time to your work.
And I would say too that it's like, I would say that you might wanna, that other people may not want you to change. And how, as a maker, being in tune with yourself, I think, about your own evolution and growth, and I guess being prepared to kind of fight for that too, I think. Is that something you've had to experience at all?
Yeah, I mean, whew. Yeah, I feel like you're just like, RaMell, tell me all of your problems.
For the whole world, man. Yeah, let's do it.
No, for real. Like, for me, like I can talk very specifically about the problems of othering other people and the problems of photography's sort of embeddedness and meaning making that is part of a larger system of oppression or whatever, because I participated in that. Like, I did that because I'm like an American. Like, that's what Americans do, you know? Like, Americans are fundamentally racist. You have to understand that, and then you can maybe get past it. But if you don't even want to agree with that, then you have no chance. And so, like, I've done all of the poor uses of cameras in places abroad, parachuted in, done the things, and then like looked at my images later and like been sincerely disappointed, but sincerely believed that this is a process of learning. And what's the opposite of this, right? Like, how do you now, like, how do you embed the camera in your consciousness as opposed to creating something that is, that's just like part of this greater system. And so the evolution of myself is actually is embedded in the film, because I'm looking at the moments and letting them unravel and letting sunrises happen in instances simultaneously. Like, that's my process, is long attention to things, giving them time, and maybe the question's right, giving them space as well.
That's beautiful. Man, I got so many things I could say. I think we've got one more question. I think we're already over time, so I'm going to ask one more from the world, and then we'll wrap it up. Interesting. Okay. This is so weird. I'm sorry. I'm like reading. I want to just read them all, but okay. So this is from Caroline. I wondered if the community saw the film and what it meant to you to screen it there. What was their response?
You know, this is also a tough question, because I'll talk specifically about Daniel and Quincy, because the film is such an abstraction that is also the truth, that is also the experience. It's like, it functions on multiple levels. And from Daniel and Quincy watching the film, even for them watching the film in Alabama, you know, it's unbelievable, you know? because we were making the film for so long, and I filmed so much that at some point we weren't making a film. It's like your friend who's like writing that book, and it's just like 7 years in, and you're like, oh, you're still writing that, huh? Yeah, and your head is like, they're not writing a book, they're just saying that. That's just what they say. You know, at some point they're just like, RaMell just always has a camera. We're not making a film, because who makes a film with a camera this big and a mic and just like points the camera at the ground, you know?
Yeah.
And so they're in the community, by proxy, are seeing themselves from angles and in moments that they weren't even necessarily present for from that angle. And in that type of beauty. Like I like to, for Daniel and Quincy, it's like a diary of moments that you don't remember, from a perspective you've never seen, and a beauty that's unfamiliar, elevated to the same space that you watch Black Panther. There's so many different levels of abstraction that it's hard, I even think, for them to articulate what it is to see themselves in that space. And but to be grounded in the answer, most of the folks from the community were like, you got it right type of thing. They were like, that's actually us. You know, like, whoa, I didn't expect it to be us, you know, like,
yeah.
Which is like the biggest compliment, that they actually saw themselves there, and it wasn't, it didn't employ their image for something that was unsettling, unfamiliar, and maybe problematic. I don't know.
Yeah. I want to end with just a question, I think, about this current moment, and however you want to kind of talk about it. I'm really curious. I know for me, I've been sort of in a place of, I think, just observation and meditation. I haven't really felt particularly creative, actually, in the past month. And I guess I'm just wondering if you want to end with some words around how, you know, your practice, this moment, however you want to get to it.
Garrett, I'm literally in the exact same mental space as you just described.
Yeah.
The only thing I've really been able to do is like stuff with my hands. I've been doing like a lot of building and a lot of construction, and a lot of like real world touching and a lot of real world feeling, and have been unable to like really conceptualize a lot. And I mean, I have no, you know, words of positivity, though I think the moment is ultimately a positive moment of great possible potential change in a darker, gloomier moment. That is always the American project in some sense. But yeah, I think it's I think making comes in many forms, and forming relationships, you know, loving someone, you know, building anything, picking up trash, like it's all art. It's just a matter of the way in which you give it meaning, the way in which you give it attention, and the way in which you believe, you know, and for us, I think, as artists, and I think this should apply to everyone, I think we should be aware that the process of imagining is also the process of constructing, and sometimes things exist like physically and symbolically before the meaning is attached to them, you know? And so it's important to like, if you can't visualize another future, it's very likely it'll never happen, you know? And so even the practice of mentally constructing utopian versions of reality is a creative process that can possibly drag us more towards it and less horizontally away from it.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. Well, we're going to conclude there. I just want to say you're brilliant and so talented and unpretentious. And everyone who's watching right now, if you haven't seen the film or if you have, watched it again. It is a religious experience, no matter where that is for you. So thank you.
Can I say something too?
No. Yeah. That was a good wrap up, man. You know?
That was a good wrap up. But my parting words are, I'm not sure how many bigger fans there are of Garrett Bradley. And I'll be real here. And you're the best, Garrett.
Thanks.
Yeah, kudos to your work and your films. And I really hope everyone has an opportunity to see Time which will literally be an unforgettable experience, but also just culturally a film that will always be, it's immediately a canonized film, I think. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Hope to see you soon.
All right. Peace.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody. Bye.
Bye. Yeah, are we still